Today we will talk about ethical egoism. According to Ayn Rand, in his writing The Virtue of Selfishness in 1961, she said the achievement of his own happiness is man's highest moral purpose. So we will tackle today what is ethical egoism and of course the other side of the notion, which is usually it is confused with the psychological egoism. So let me start with a scenario. Is there a duty to help the starving? Do we have the obligation to feed those who are starving? Each year, millions of people die from health problems brought on by malnutrition. Often those who die are children. Every day, around 22,000 children under the age of 5 die, almost always from preventable causes. That comes to over 8 million deaths each year. So even if this estimate is too high, the number who die is staggering. Poverty poses an acute problem for many of us who are not poor. We spend money on ourselves, not only on necessities, but on luxuries like DVDs, jewelry, concert tickets, iPads, and so on. Example, in America, even people with modest incomes enjoy such things, but we could forego our luxuries and give the money for famine relief instead. The fact that we don't suggest that we regard our luxuries as more important than the lives of the starving. Can we do that? Is that the possibility that we will set aside the things that give us joy and comfort? Like watching cine, like traveling somewhere, spending a lot of monies. Can we spare that money instead and give that to those who are starving, those who are suffering poverty and malnutrition? Why do we let people starve when we could save them? Few of us actually believe our luxuries are that important. Most of us, if asked the question directly, would probably be a bit embarrassed, and we might say we should do more to help. One reason we don't do more is that we rarely think about the problem. Living our own comfortable lives, we are insulated from it. The starving people are dying at some distance from us. We do not see them, and we can avoid even thinking about them. When we do think of them, it is only abstractly, not really dwelling or immersing yourself to them, but merely as statistics. Unfortunately for the hungry, statistics have little power to move us. So for example, in a scenario during the earthquake in Japan in 2011, people respond differently when there was a crisis in that particular disaster, killing thousands, triggering a tsunami, and causing meltdowns at several nuclear power plants. Then the crisis is big news, and relief efforts are mobilized. But when the needy are scattered, the situation does not seem so pressing. The 8 million children who die every year would probably be saved if they were all gathered in, say for example, in Manila. So in this particular scenario, we tend to help if the problem is accumulated and isolated, not scattered. Unlike in the scenario where in a certain statistics that there are 8 million children die every year, but that is scattered, some in the Philippines, some in Japan, some in South Africa, but mostly South Africa, some in the other countries like India, part of Central Asia, Europe, as well as America. Since that is scattered, we tend not to really help. Just even here in Dumaguete, like in the front of Cathedral and in other areas of part of Dumaguete, there are beggars. We tend to disregard them, and we really do not give importance to their needs. But leaving aside the question of why we behave as we do, what is our duty? What should we do? Common sense might tell us to balance our own interests against the interest of others. It is understandable, of course, that we look out for ourselves and people cannot be blamed for attending to their own basic needs. But at the same time, the needs of others are important. And when we can help others, especially little cost to ourselves, we should do so. If you have an extra $10 and giving it to charity would help save a child's life, then common sense morality would say that you should do so. This way of thinking assumes that we have duties to others, simply because they are people who could be helped or harmed by what we do. If a certain action would benefit or harm other people, then that is a reason why we should or should not perform that action. The common sense assumption is that other people's interests count from a moral point of view. But one person's common sense is another person's naive platitude. Some people believe that we have no duties to others, in their view, known as ethical egoism, and that is what we're going to talk about today. Each person ought to pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. This is the morality of selfishness. It holds that our only duty is to do what is best for ourselves. Other people matter only so far as they can benefit us. So this kind of morality is somewhat different from others as we discussed previously. This is also called as the morality of selfishness since there is a point of view that men or human beings tend to pursue one's needs, one's wants, no? So we have to talk about later on. But before that, we should discuss a theory it is often confused with, which is, I said, psychological egoism. Ethical egoism claims that each person ought to pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively, while psychological egoism, by contrast, asserts that each person does in fact pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. Thus, these theories are very different. It is one thing to say that people are self-interested and that our neighbors will not give to charity. It is quite another thing to say that people ought to be self-interested and that our neighbors ought not to give to charity. So, ethical egoism, mostly you are self-interested, you are going to pursue or focus on your self-interest. But it seems like there is a small hole that you might give into charity to help now. While psychological egoism, it's much more extreme that you are not to give in to charity. You are close to help. You will not help, in short. Psychological egoism makes a claim about human nature. I have to be very clear that psychological egoism is not a moral theory. It is a psychological theory. Makes a claim about human nature or about the way things are. Psychological egoism trying to convey that these are people. The people are naturally selfish, naturally bound to prioritize oneself over the others. Ethical egoism makes a claim about morality or about the way things should be, while ethical egoism makes a claim about morality or about the way things should be. So this is kind of different because it's not really inclining itself to how things are, no, but only somehow prescribing. As I said earlier, psychological egoism is not a theory of ethics, rather it is a theory of human psychology. But atheists have always worried about it. If psychological egoism were true, then moral philosophy itself would seem pointless. Now, when we talk about psychology, it is backed by science, it is backed by evidence. No? So that's why ethicists would worry that if that is true, then the morality of selfishness, or the morality about, or the ethical egoism is pointless. So after all, if people are going to behave selfishly no matter what, then what's the point of discussing what they ought to do? Whatever it is they ought to do, they aren't going to do it. It might be naive of us to think that our moral theories can matter in the real world. So this is what we're going to talk about today now. The difference, I would like to separate the difference between psychological egoism and ethical egoism for us to know the distinction between these two notions. Now, psychological egoism is a theory of human psychology, while ethical egoism is a moral theory. So we have to weigh in both of these notions to know which one is much more acceptable. So we have to answer some questions before going to the bottom line. Is altruism possible? When World War II began, Raoul Wallenberg was an unknown businessman living in Sweden. Sweden was a good place to be during the war. As a neutral country, it was never bombed, blockaded, or invaded. Yet in 1944, Wallenberg voluntarily left Sweden for Nazi-controlled Hungary. Officially, Wallenberg was going to be just another Swedish diplomat in Budapest. However, his real mission was to save lives. In Hungary, Hitler had begun implementing the final solution to the Jewish problem. Jews were being rounded up, deported, and then murdered at Nazi killing stations. Wallenberg wanted to stop the slaughter. So this is somewhat like the same with President Kazan before, no? Where he did everything he could to save some as much as Jews he can. Wallenberg did help to persuade the Hungarian government to hold the deportations. However, the Hungarian government was soon replaced by a Nazi puppet regime, and the mass killing resumed. Wallenberg then issued the Swedish protective passes to thousands of Jews, insisting that they all had connections to Sweden and were under the protection of his government. Wallenberg helped many people hide. When they were discovered, he would stand between them and the Nazis, telling the Germans that they would have to shoot him first, willing to sacrifice his own self. Wallenberg saved thousands of human lives. At the end of the war, when chaos prevailed, he stayed behind as other diplomats fled. After the war, Wallenberg disappeared, and for a long time his fate was unknown. Now we believe that he was killed not by the Germans but by the Soviets, who imprisoned him after taking over Hungary. Wallenberg's story is especially dramatic, but it is not unique. The Israeli government recognizes over 22,000 Gentiles who risked their lives trying to save Jews from being murdered. In the Holocaust, the Israelis call these women and men the righteous among the nations. And though few of us have saved lives, acts of altruism appear to be common. When we talk about altruism, it is self-sacrificing acts. Now, you are willing to help in any means possible. People do favors for one another. They give blood, they build homeless shelters, they volunteer in hospitals. Usually this is the story of the saints and the good people, like Mother Teresa. They read to the blind. Many people give money to worthy causes. In some cases, the amount given is extraordinary. Say for example, Warren Buffett, an American businessman, gave $37 billion to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to promote global health and education. Zell Kravinsky, an American real estate investor, gave his entire $45 million fortune to charity. And then, for good measure, Kravinsky donated one of his kidneys to a complete stranger. And now there is Ursula McCarthy, an 87-year-old African-American woman from Hattiesburg, Mississippi, gave $150,000 to endow a scholarship fund at the University of Southern Mississippi. For 75 years, she had saved up money working as a maid. She never owned a car, and at the age of 87, she still walked over a mile to the nearest grocery store, pushing her own shopping cart. These are remarkable deeds, but should they be taken at face value? According to psychological egoism, we may believe ourselves to be noble and self-sacrificing, but that is only an illusion. In reality, we care only for ourselves. Could this theory be true? Why have people believed it? In the face of so much evidence to the contrary, two arguments are often given for psychological egoism. So now we are having distinction between the two. When we talk about ethical egoism, it's more on giving into charity, while psychological egoism is on the contrary. Now, it seems like although you are helping, but the favor is in yourself, that it benefits you. So we have to narrow down the difference between the two. The argument, what we always do, what we want to do. So every act you have ever performed since the day you were born was performed because you wanted something. So that was according to Dale Carnegie. Now, every act you have ever performed since the day you were born was performed because you wanted something. Carnegie thought of desire is the key to human psychology. The thought of desire. Thus, when we describe one person's action as altruistic and another person's action as self-interested, we may be overlooking the fact that in each case, the person is merely doing what he or she most wants to do. For example, if Raoul Wallenberg chose to go to Hungary, then he wanted to go there more than he wanted to remain in Sweden. And why should he be praised for altruism or heroism when he was only doing what he wanted to do? No? Imagine, can you picture it out, or imagine the situation that Wallenberg was living peacefully in Sweden, but later on, due to the condition in Hungary that many Jews were killed, deported and tortured, he went there to help. But then it seems like that action was being invalidated, that he was not really willing to help, but he just only wanted, he wanted to be there and to stay in Sweden. It seems like the argument is that he just wanted to help, and the virtue or the value of helping is no longer taken at face value. If you can imagine that. In every situation or scenario, there is always an argument of negative and positive. So his actions sprung, according to this argument, his actions sprung from his own desires, from his own sense of what he wanted, as I said earlier. Thus, he was moved by his own self-interest. And because the same may be said about any alleged act of kindness, we can conclude that psychological egoism must be true. That selfishness at its peak, it's totally extreme. So this argument, however, is a flawed. Take note, this is flawed argument. There are things that we do not because we want to, but because we feel that we ought to. Mayroon tayong kinahanglan or dapat na buhaton. For example, I may write my grandmother a letter because I promised my mother I would, even though I don't want to do it. It is sometimes suggested that we do such things because we most want to keep our promises. But that is not true. Now, it seems like that scenario that you write, you wrote a letter for your grandmother because you promised your grandmother and that you will be writing. So it seems like it's being invalidated that you write because that is what you wanted to do, and that is to fulfill the promise. If you can just imagine the eagerness not to fulfill the promise and not really doing it, no. So we have to explain that it is simply false, no, that you are doing it because you wanted to do it. It is simply false to say that my strongest desire, pinakagusto nako, is to keep my promise and to fulfill my promise. What I most want is to break my promise. Ganahan kay kung dili buhaton, no, ang pagsulat. But I don't, as a matter of conscience. So that is being invalidated. I mean, that is being refuted, no? That your strongest desire was to fulfill the promise. Now that is not that's not what really you want, no? You don't really want to write the letter, but you did because of the move of your conscience. For all we know, Wallenberg was in this position. Perhaps he wanted to stay in Sweden, but he felt that he had to go to Hungary to save lives. In any case, the fact that he chose to go does not simply that he most wanted to do so. The argument has another flaw, second flaw. Nailaing sayo. Suppose we concede, no, atong dawaton, that we always act on our strongest desires. Even if this were so, it would not follow that Wallenberg acted out of self-interest. Dili siya conclusion nga iya to siyang kagustuhan. That's something that can benefit himself, no? For if Wallenberg wanted to help others, even at great risk to himself, then that is precisely what makes his behavior contrary to psychological egoism. No? Buhaton nimo to at the expense of your life, and that is no longer that's no longer in congruence to what psychological egoism would say, because it should not be you should not be sacrificing yourself. The mere fact that you act on your own desires does not mean that you are looking out for yourself. It all depends on what you desire. If you care only about yourself and give no thought to others, then you are acting out of self-interest. But if you want other people to be happy and you act on that desire, then you are not. Because the bottom line of being selfish is to make yourself enjoy, and be happy. But acting on the desire to make others, to make other people to be happy, although you are not, then that is not, or contrary to psychological egoism. To put the point another way, in assessing whether an action is self-interested, the issue is not whether the action is based on a desire. The issue what kind of desire it is based on. If you want to help someone or someone else, then your motive is altruistic, not self-interested. Therefore, this argument goes wrong in just about every way that an argument can go wrong. The premise is not true. We don't always do what we most want to do. And even if it were true, the conclusion would not follow from it. So the premise is false and the conclusion is false. So that is a very wrong argument. The second argument is that the argument that we always do what makes us feel good. The second argument for psychological egoism appeals to the fact that the so-called altruistic actions produce a sense of self-satisfaction or gratification in the person who performs them. Acting unselfishly makes people feel good about themselves, and that is the real point of it. So imong gibuhat kay makahatag nimong kalipay. I guess another example of this is that politicians helping out, during or nearing election. So according to a 19th century newspaper, this argument was made by Abraham Lincoln. The Springfield, Illinois Monitor. It's a newspaper. This is the scenario. Mr. Lincoln once remarked to a fellow passenger, to an old-time mud coach, that all men were prompted by selfishness in doing good. So his fellow passenger was antagonizing this position when they were passing over a corduroy bridge that spanned the slough. As they crossed in the bridge, they spied an old razorback saw on the bank making a terrible noise, because her pigs had got into the slough and were in danger of drowning. As the old coach began to climb the hill, Mr. Lincoln called out, "Driver, can't you stop just a moment?" Then Mr. Lincoln jumped out, ran back, and lifted the little pigs out of the mud and water and, and placed them on the bank. When he returned, his companion remarked, "Now, Abe, where does selfishness come in on this little episode?" "Why, bless your soul, Ed, that was the very essence of selfishness. I should have had no peace of mind all day. I had gone on and left that suffering old soul worrying over those pigs. I did it to get peace of mind, don't you see?" So in this particular situation, person was actually saw, no, kayang nakita ang usa ka baboy nga sigig tungod kay ang iyahang piglets or in the mud and in the water in the fear of drowning, no, malumos na. So with that imagination in mind, no, although you're only passing by in that location, imagining that, it seems like you're troubled, no, you're triggered nga wala kay nahimo. So although he helped, those little pigs to be saved as an act of altruism or heroism, it was not really the focus why he did it. He did it for him to have peace of mind. So in this story, Honest Abe employs a time-honored tactic of psychological egoism. So that was an example of psychological egoism. The strategy of reinterpreting motives. Everyone knows that people sometimes seem to act altruistically, but if we look deeper, we may find that something else is going on. And usually it is not hard to discover that the unselfish behavior is actually connected to some benefits for the person who does it. Thus, Lincoln talks about the peace of mind he got from rescuing the pigs. So the conclusion about psychological egoism. If psychological egoism is implausible, why have so many intelligent people have been attracted to it? So kung dili ni siya maayo, no? If it's not really a good notion or theory, nganong daghan mang mga influential or intelligent people are attracted to this kind of theory. Some people like the theory, a cynical view of human nature. The answer was it's only part of a cynical view of human nature. Others may like its simplicity. And indeed, it would be pleasing if a single factor could explain in all human behavior, but human beings seem to be too complicated for that. Psychological egoism is not a credible theory. Thus, morality has nothing to fear from psychological egoism, given that we can be moved by regard for others. It is not pointless to talk about whether we should help our neighbors. Moral theorizing need not be naive endeavor based on unrealistic view of human nature. So now we know the difference between psychological egoism. That psychological egoism is much more extreme than ethical egoism, because it's not really giving into charity or to altruistic acts. Now, although it makes some altruistic acts that appear to be but it's not really the focus or the interest, but the benefit it may get now from doing it. So now let's proceed to ethical egoism. I will be giving 3 arguments which will talk about ethical egoism. So again, it is a doctrine that each person ought to pursue his or her own self-interest exclusively. This is not the common sense idea that one should promote one's own interest in addition to the interest of others. Sa dili na siya mixture, no, or panagkuyog, no, at the same time. So this is not the common sense idea nga i-promote nimo ang imong self-interest plus the interest of others. It is the radical idea that the principle of self-interest accounts for all of one's obligations. It does not tell you to avoid helping others, unlike psychological egoism. Sometimes your interest will coincide with the well-being of others, so by helping yourself, you'll help them too. For example, if you can convince your teacher to cancel the assignment, this will benefit you and your classmates. Ethical egoism does not forbid such actions. In fact, it may recommend them. The theory insists only that in such cases, the benefit to others is not what makes the act right. Rather, the act is right because it is to your advantage, not to your own advantage. Nor does ethical egoism imply that in pursuing your interests, you should always do what you want to do or what offers you the most short-term pleasure. Someone may want to smoke cigarettes or bet all his money at the racetrack or set up a meth lab in his basement. Ethical egoism would frown on all this. Despite the short-term benefits, ethical egoism says that a person ought to do what really is in his or her own best interest over the long run. It endorses selfishness, not foolishness. Now let's discuss the 3 main arguments for ethical egoism. Number 1 is the argument that altruism is self-defeating. When you talk about self-defeating, it seems like there's a lapse. No, you cannot really achieve the end of what you want. No? The real meaning of altruism is not being fulfilled. No? The act of heroism seems like it is the opposite. These are the conditions. Say for example, 1. Each of us is intimately familiar with our own individual wants and needs. Kay balota sa atong gusto, kinahanglan. Moreover, each of us is uniquely placed to pursue those wants and needs effectively. No, ganahan kay itong mahitabo or mahimo katong atong maganahan o kinahanglan. At the same time, we understand the desires and needs of other people only imperfectly. Na kahibaluta sa kinahanglan usab sa uban, but just that imperfectly, and we are not well situated to pursue them. Therefore, if we try to be our brother's keeper, we will often bungle the job and end up doing more harm than good. You thank yourself that you're helping, but in the end, you are not helping. Mas nasuko pang imong gitabangan. At the same time, the second one, the policy of looking out for others is an offensive intrusion into other people's privacy. So it is essentially a policy of minding other people's business. No? You wanted to help, but you can also trespass the privacy. So, di pa siya maayo. The third one, making other people the object of one's charity is degrading them. No? Kung concerned po kay kanila, it seems like you're degrading them. It seems like you're robbing them their dignity and self-respect. No? In effect, to them, it seems like you are telling them that they are not competent to care for themselves, and the statement is self-fulfilling. They cease to be self-reliant and become passively dependent on others. That is why the recipients of charity are often resentful rather than appreciative. no? Or mas nagdumot bang itabangan, no? Kaysa mo appreciate. In each case, the policy of looking out for others is said to be self-defeating. If you want to do what is best for people, we should not adopt the so-called altruistic policies. On the contrary, if each person looks after his or her own interest, everyone will be better off. The argument concludes that we should adopt certain policies of behavior, and on the surface that they appear to be egoistic policies. However, the reason we should adopt those policies is decided unegoistic. It is said that adopting those policies will promote the betterment of society. But according to ethical egoism, that is not something we should care about. Spelled out fully, the argument says, we ought to do whatever will best promote everyone's interest. Second, the best way to promote everyone's interest is for each of us to pursue our own interest exclusively. Therefore, each of us should pursue our own interest exclusively. So that is the premise, the second premise, and the conclusion. So for ethical egoism, it's for the first argument that the first argument is talking about altruism is self-defeating. So it's not suggesting that you have to act altruistically, but instead in this pattern. First is that kinahanglan natong buhaton ang makahatag o that will promote everyone's interest. So because in that way, by promoting the interest of others, it is also promoting your own. So therefore, in that following that argument, that each of us should pursue our own interest exclusively, because that also regards the interest of others. The second argument is Ayn Rand's argument. She existed 1905 to 1982, so that was around 77 years old. Is not read much by philosophers. So Ayn Rand regarded the ethics of altruism as totally destructive idea. So it's the same with the first argument earlier, that it's a self-defeating, both in society as a whole and in the lives of those taken in by it. Altruism, to her way of thinking, leads to a denial of the value of the individual. It says to a person, your life is merely something to be sacrificed. She doesn't want that altruism, that to act heroically, and at the same time to sacrifice yourself to help or to save others. She was saying that our life is not merely something to be sacrificed. If a man accepts the ethics of altruism, his first concern is not to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. So those who promote the ethics of altruism are beneath contempt. They are parasites. Worse description, they are parasites who, rather than working to build and sustain their own lives, leech off those who do. Parasites ang yung description to those who promotes altruism. I beg to disagree on that matter. But sometimes we have, But for the sake of discussion, she doesn't support the idea of promoting altruism. She said, parasites, moochers, looters, brutes, and thugs can be of no value to a human being, nor can he gain any benefit from living in a society geared to their needs, demands, and protection. A society that treats him as a sacrificial animal and penalizes him for his virtues in order to reward them for their vices, which means a society based on the ethics of altruism. I guess the ethics of altruism of Ayn Rand is much radical and extreme now, because it seems like treating the person who act on basing on altruism or altruistic acts. She was like calling them as a sacrificial animal. So by sacrificing one's life, Rand does not mean anything so dramatic as dying. A person's life consists in part of projects undertaken and goods earned and created. Thus, to demand that a person abandon his projects or give up his goods is to demand that he sacrifice his life. Sir Rand also suggests that there is a metaphysical basis for ethical egoism. Somehow, it is the only ethic that takes seriously the reality of the individual person. She bemoans the enormity of the extent to which altruism erodes man's capacity to grasp the value of an individual life. It reveals a mind from which the reality of a human being has been wiped out. What then of the hungry children? About the start of this discussion. It might be said that ethical egoism itself reveals a mind from which the reality of human being has been wiped out, namely the human being who is starving. But Rand quotes the answer given by one of her followers. Once when Barbara Brandon was asked by a student what will happen to the poor, she answered, "If you want to help them, you will not be stopped." So all these remarks are part of one continuous argument that goes something like this. Each person has only one life to live. This is the pattern of Ayn Rand's argument. If we value the individual, then we must agree that this life is of supreme importance. After all, it is all one has and all one is. The ethics of altruism regards the life of the individual as something that may be sacrificed for the good of others. Therefore, the ethics of altruism does not take seriously the value of the individual. Third, ethical egoism, which allows each person to view his or her own life as being of ultimate value, does take the individual seriously. It is in fact the only philosophy that does. Thus, ethical egoism is the philosophy that we ought to accept. So that is the arguments of Ayn Rand, that the ethical egoism that we have to follow, that it should allow each person to view his or her own life as being of ultimate value, may pinaka-importante, and thus take the individual seriously. So this is the only philosophy that we have to accept according to him, to her. The third argument is the ethical egoism as compatible with common sense morality. If you do not know common sense morality, this is the usual response that we have to act on certain scenarios that is requiring us to do something. No? Common sense morality, it is always guided, of course, by common sense and by our law. No, when the law says that you should not throw garbage anywhere, and to put it on the proper place, you have to do it by virtue of your common sense. But if you have no common sense, then you will disobey that reminder. So ethical egoism is compatible with common sense morality. So ethical egoism is usually presented as a revisionist moral philosophy, that is, as a philosophy that says our common sense moral views are mistaken. It is possible, however, to interpret ethical egoism as a theory that accepts common sense morality. Thus, this interpretation goes as follows. Ordinary morality consists in obeying certain rules. We must speak the truth, keep our promises, avoid harming others, and so on. So that is also an example of common sense morality, that we have to speak the truth, keep our promises, avoid harming others. At first glance, these duties appear to have little in common. They are just a bunch of discrete rules, yet there may be a unity to them. Ethical egoists would say that all these duties are ultimately derived from the one fundamental principle of self-interest. Understood in this way, ethical egoism is not such a radical doctrine. It does not challenge common sense morality. It only tries to explain and systematize it, and it does not surprisingly good job. It can provide plausible explanation for all of the duties mentioned. So here are the examples. The duty not to harm others. If we do things that harm other people will not mind doing things that harm us. No, it will be equal reaction. Equal reaction. So if you harm them, in return they will harm you. So it's not really a serious matter. You should do it seems like normal. So we will be shunned and despised. Others will not be our friends and will not help us out when we need it. If our offenses are serious enough, we may end up in jail. Thus, it is to our own advantage to avoid harming others. No? So, according to earlier, no, to the second argument, that the action is right if it promotes to our own advantage, no? If it is inclined to our own advantage. Not the duty not to harm others is a common sense morality, or a rule under common sense morality. Now, if you will disobey that, then others will harm you. Then there are serious consequences to that. So, as a conclusion, it is to our own advantage to avoid harming others. Second, the duty not to lie. If we lie to other people, we will suffer all the ill effects to a bad reputation. People will distrust us and avoid doing business with us. People will be dishonest with us once they realize that we have been dishonest with them. Thus, it is to our own advantage to be truthful. A third example is the duty to keep our promises. It is our own advantage as well to enter into mutually beneficial arrangements with other people. To benefit from those arrangements, we need to be able to rely on others to keep their word. But if we can hardly expect them to do that if we do not keep our promises to them. Therefore, from the point of view of self-interest, we should keep our promises. Alright, so those are the three arguments following ethical egoism. That it does not stop us from promoting the interest of others, but the argument follows from the first argument that we have to promote the everyone's self-interest. That way, it also regards or our by promoting the interest of others, it is also like pursuing our own interests. So that's it. Now, the second argument was the Ayn Rand's argument, which the focus was our own life, but it does not stop us. Now, Ayn Rand's argument does not hinder us to help others. And the third argument, that it is compatible with common sense morality. So I will end up from here. Now I'll be giving you assessment later on after watching this recorded discussion.